Good morning, welcome to my talk on metadata for the public sector from open source. I have to admit, this talk was a little bit weird in preparation because usually the closer I get to my talk and the more I run through the slides, the higher my confidence is in the slides, but oddly here it was the opposite. So I was walking this morning to the venue and I was like thinking, should I just freestyle it or rearrange the slides? And then I read my proposal again and I saw, the pitch is already in the proposal. So my first question is like, who actually wrote or read the description in the program? All right, so, okay. Hopefully, or maybe rephrase it. So are you here now because you're convinced of the pitch? Or because you're here to tell me that I'm an idiot? Okay. Interested. Okay. All right. So let's. I guess that's a decent enough grounding. So basically, I already roughly sold you on the idea, and now I will explain to you how and why this all comes about. So. Essentially, what I realized with some discussions is that there is an information gap that advantages the proprietary world, right? So if I want to procure something, then as a procurement officer, I can get the information I need very efficiently from the proprietary world. Maybe there's even some, old school lobbying, we see each other at the right conferences type of thing going on, but I can get essentially the information that I need to do procurement very easily. So that's one problem. And the other one is that classically procurement is done via price or high emphasis on price, which also advantages proprietary, mostly through licensing, etc. Or proprietary licenses, and that's a gap that I identified. At the same time, maintaining metadata is a lot of effort, so there has to be a good reason to go through that effort, right? And that's what I want to kind of talk about here, is like going through some of the metadata that I think could be useful and having sort of a dialogue with the open source community and maintainers of open source to figure out what's the right amount to make this work. I talked to a lot of policy people and they generally said, yeah, great, very well aligned with EU policies and strategies. But yeah, now kind of the other side is important too. Now, maybe briefly about like, who am I? Why do I talk about this? So I'm a long-time open source developer. That being said, I started the startup in 2018, and then I kind of dropped out of the scene a little bit, too busy with that work. But I do have a background in leadership, in the PHP project itself, and Symfony itself. But I'm not a Debian maintainer of like that sort of scale. I also work at an institute in Switzerland that is very much leading on topics around open source in Switzerland. And one of the products that we actually maintain there is the OSS directory. And that's kind of also the origin story of how this all came about. So Schleswig-Holstein, as many of you are probably aware, is kind of leading the charge for adopting open source in the public sector. They went to the Open Source Business Alliance and said, we have a challenge, is that how do the procurement officers find the vendors that can actually service the open source products, or actually first find the open source products and then find the vendors, right? And then the OSBA said, well, we know this OSS directory thing. And that's the only open source catalog that I'm aware of that actually does that has both the open source software in there, but also vendors. So they came to us, we had a meeting, and we talked about it, and one of the peculiarities of the open source directory is that all the data is kind of centrally managed, like we put it there. And that's different than most of all the other open source catalogs that you could find, that all kind of take this public code YAML file, parse it, and then drop the data in there. So I was thinking after that meeting, like, yeah, that's not great that we are doing the centrally managed, and we should also adopt the decentralized approach as well. But as you dive into public code YAML, you quickly realize it's built for just the public sector, essentially. So there's a lot of things in there that just don't make sense for an open source project. There's a lot of data that is better or already placed in other things, like your package JSON file and things like that. It has version stuff in there. It has like, who is the supplier that is maintaining the instance, because the software is built for one instance, right? So there's a lot of things in there that don't really fit. And so I started researching this, what we can do to kind of evolve public code YAML. And as part of that, I kind of also thought about, like, so what is a public procurement officer? What do they actually ask themselves, right? Or in some ways also, what should they be asking themselves, right? So first they have to find it, like they have to know it exists, right? If they have a need, they can go to Microsoft and say, this is our need, and then Microsoft will make sure that they know the products that they are supposed to be buying, right? That doesn't exist necessarily for the open source world in that way, right? Then the evidence that is then presented to them, whatever they find, like how can they evaluate it? Is it accurate? Is it up to date? Things like that. So in that spirit, also some procurement officers may start checking stuff, right? But then it's being rechecked and checked over again, right? And it's a lot of effort to do this sort of thing. Then again, once they found the software and they've said it's viable, it checks all the boxes, then who can support it? Will it stay maintained? And if I spend on it in the spirit of public money, public code, will the results actually end up in upstream, right? So these are all questions that I think they should be asking themselves, but answering these questions today is a lot of effort. And again, this falls back to that gap where they say, well, we tried very hard, but let's go with proprietary for this one project, right? And that kind of stays in that way in perpetuity. So, as I already said, the idea would be to evolve the public code YAML standard. Essentially, the idea of this, or maybe actually, who here knows about public code YAML? Maybe raise your hand. So not that many. So it's a YAML file that you put into the root of your source repository, and you add, and basically it's a place for adding this type of metadata. So what I mentioned, that's like what's the name, and they've, as I mentioned, added a lot of stuff that is not really relevant, like who is the maintainer of the instance of this product that was built, right? But the idea is that you have all these controllable facts, you put it in there, and then you can have crawlers that find these. They crawl GitHub, GitLab.com, maybe some national forages like opencode.de, etc. And that way you can build up a catalog. What I kind of in the evolution would propose to them is drop all this dynamic evidence, like the version number of the last release that shouldn't be in there. We have other places to place this type of thing. And then I would also suggest to them to add more stuff, like information about accessibility. So as a procurement officer, I can say, we have requirements around accessibility. Where do I find the information about accessibility? Security. I don't know if it should be in the standard, but there's a huge gap that, okay, we have SBOMs, but how do you find the last SBOM of the last release? It's not really, there's not really a standard around this. So one of the pieces in there is a template format where you can say, I stick a version in there and then I find the SBOM. Now, maybe to explain again, so why public code YAML? Why not a new standard? And generally, obviously, standards and establishing standards is very, very hard. So if there's something that is kind of roughly that, I think it's a wise idea to try to see if you can kind of use that momentum and that fact to your advantage. And the reality is that the EU specifically has really the public sector really has embraced the standard already, right? So they are like all the catalogs, the national catalogs and the one from the European Commission, they're all built around public code YAML already. And so this, the standard is established, the tooling is established, and it's been proven to work, right? They are discovering things, they can keep things up to date that way. And so that's kind of the idea. Now, it's not the idea that this should become the one standard to rule everything, right? So the idea is that it points to evidence, right? So it points to your SBOM or the template, how your SBOMs look like. It points to your accessibility information, right? So it's not supposed to be like this thing that has a billion amount of characters in it. It's more like this one place that you can start from, and then you find all the information, and that is structured, and again, is crawlable. So, as I mentioned, historically, it was built for the public sector in Italy, has branched out now, but the vision that I'm trying to sell here is that it should be for all open source software. And if we achieve this vision, this gap that I mentioned about earlier, where Microsoft, Adobe, etc., have like a more efficient way to get their information to the procurement officer, or the procurement officers can get it more efficiently. If we adopt this type of metadata approach, we can turn it to an advantage, because Microsoft, Adobe, etc., they're all silos, right? But if we have a single catalog where a procurement officer can say, I need a CMS that can also work as a CRM, and where there are vendors that are in my vicinity, right? If they can answer that question with a single catalog, then suddenly this disadvantage becomes to an advantage. Now, I said this very early on, obviously asking the open source community to maintain such metadata, even though I said, well, it's just pointing to evidence, etc., it's still work, right? It's still real work. And the question is like, why should open source projects bother? And I think initially, the projects that will bother most are the single vendor open source projects that are targeting the public sector to begin with. So, you know, Nextclouds and Univention, etc., right? These are kind of the obvious ones that would care. The next round would be where it's not a single vendor open source project, but a lot of vendors in that community are servicing the public sector. And then it essentially is whoever wants to sell this as a product, it should be their business to maintain that, that metadata format. But ideally, it's still kind of obviously officially blessed by the open source project. So it sits in the code repository and not in some other place, because then you could have competing versions and you don't know which one to trust, right? So it still needs collaboration with the open source project itself. And then hopefully, you know, maybe we improve the tooling continuously, and the more broader open source community just adopts it. Yeah, like, as I started working on this topic, I found actually that there are lots of initiatives for catalog. So I talked to, if I remember, it's softwarehub.schule. So they're trying to build a catalog of software, proprietary and open source, for universities in Germany, right? And then they send out these Excel sheets with questionnaires, right? And they send them to vendors. And so if that's going to be the reality, right, then open source projects will get like a dozen of these questionnaires, and they will rightfully be very annoyed by them, right? And they will not get answered, right? So again, if we have this metadata in a standardized format once, and again, public code YAML is already embraced by the public sector, then that kind of goes away, right? You just have to fill it out once, keep maintaining it, rather than doing it over and over, and you are still featured in all these places. Also, I think it's an opportunity to showcase kind of invisible work. So I had a discussion with people in Berlin that are responsible for accessibility checks. And they said, well, Berlin has an open source first strategy, and now they're getting swamped by these requests for, okay, video conferencing, but accessible, and open source, right? And this and this and this. And they cannot answer these questions because if you go to, unfortunately, many open source projects, you'll not find a single landing spot very quickly that will, put together all the accessibility information, right? So you have to dig. Last summer I did a study on OpenDesk, and it's kind of a sad reality, at least at that time, OpenDesk documentation had nothing about accessibility. Then you could dig deeper, and then for the vendors, you could find something, but even they also did not have a single place, and sometimes you even need third-party vendors to kind of complete the loop, right? And that's, if that's the reality, it just means that they're going to not procure open source, and they're going to say, well, for this we tried, but we failed, right? And even if they then finally do this, right, they found this information, then like the people in Berlin were like, yeah, but where do we place it so that others can use these findings, right? And obviously they could make a project and kind of build this catalog up themselves, but it's much better if we do this together, right? And so with this type of format, I think there's going to be a place for accessibility. Here's the URL for the aggregated accessibility information of my open source project. And if I already did the work, then this is great. Finally, it's visible, right? And before it was kind of hidden away, right? So in the catalog, people can set a flag. Does it have accessibility information? And then it's going to be yes, and you're going to be found as your open source project. Also, the idea is that, and this is a kind of a related standard that I'm also proposing, is trying to make who does the good upstream work, trying to make that visible as well in the structured format, so that the right vendors win and not those that are just like extracting value from open source but not giving anything back. And at the end of the day, I understand not everybody cares about what the public sector wants. You can choose that in your open source project, you don't need that, you don't want that, or it's not a priority. But I think for many, it's an opportunity to actually get more users, get more contributors, get more funding into the project to make it more sustainable. So I think that's essentially the big opportunity here. So in terms of design simples, I mentioned a couple already. So the authority flows from the source. So this file sits in the code repository in the root. It only contains kind of the slow changing data, not version information, dependencies, and stuff like that. It contains lookup keys, like where do you find the actual detailed information, ideally also in structured format or in prose, but again, at least that way it's kind of more discoverable. And also there are a lot of optional fields, or that's the vision of it, that you don't feel pressured to fill out everything. Like, at least from the point of view of the standard, it's not a failure if something is missing. Obviously, catalogs that consume this data, they can decide it's a problem, right? If you have a catalog that focuses on accessibility, if you don't have the accessibility information, they can choose to not even catalog you, right? They can say, I don't want this data, right? So I can't say that the catalogs will maybe make it have some sort of scoring, but in terms of the format, most of it is optional. So maybe, so essentially that's the smallest public code YAML file you could have, right? A name, a URL, and your license. Maybe let's sum here. You could, and these are things that I'm proposing. So for example, you could have your stewards listed in here. If the CRA actually applies to you according to you, right? So this is your self-attesting here. Life cycle, so this is kind of when did you last look at the file. It's not something that you have to keep updating, but basically you could say once a year I look at the file, I just update that date, and then I don't have to make fake changes to show that I'm still alive and the data is still valid. I could envision that you actually put in here which package repositories you actually target, so that if your package ends up in a different package repository, it's clear to users if they should actually trust this or not. Yeah, this what I also already mentioned, like the SBOM, that you could have sort of a template URL in there. Yeah, accessibility information. What else? Certifications that you have received for your product, for your project, etc. So I'm mentioning these not because I think that these are like the perfect format how this should be, but kind of to give a vision of what could be in such a standard. And obviously there should be a dialogue and not just me defining what the format should be. Is that somewhat clear? I see a little bit of nodding. Okay. Sorry, let me go back. My fancy structure is kind of failing me right now. All right. So this is the even grander vision of it all. So as you can see here, so you have data sorters, the open source project, it produced the SBOMs. But the idea is that also we could have other types of metadata that could also be useful. Contribution credit is one area that I think could be very interesting. So I mentioned it would be great if during the procurement process, you could have criteria that say, we will own or we will score the tenders based on if they will actually upstream the changes. And so for this, and this is something, for example, the OSBA is recommending, but if this is not something that you can do in a data-driven way, it's really challenging, again, for procurement officers. They will say, okay, great, yeah, I want that. I adhere to the vision of a public code or public money, public code. But if it's not data-driven, it's a risk to them, right? They will be attacked, right? Because they will have to examine it one by one. Now, if you would have the projects themselves maintain a registry of who the good vendors are, then this now becomes data-driven. And this is actually something the Drupal community is doing. So they're not doing it just by looking at like commits and I don't know, lines of code. So what they do there is that they have initiatives, and the initiative leads gets to allocate credits. And this could be for organizing a meeting, for doing UX work, and of course also for code changes. And if that type of data, so they have a repository for this, you can do this for Drupal, you can look it up, you can see who the vendors are that will upstream, most likely, because they have the experience, they have the track record. And maybe my one detail that is important there, the way that Drupal does it is that obviously individuals are doing the work, right? But these individuals then say, I did it on behalf of company X, right? And so that fact stays with company X, right? So even if that person switches employer, it doesn't suddenly move that track record, for better or for worse, right? I think it's valid because they paid for it, they've shown a commitment, but it also means that if they fire everyone that did their work, then they have the track record, but no longer the knowledge, right? So that's something to be aware of. But it's really cool what they've built. They've did it actually, I think last year or so. So it's now very much SaaSable, right? So it's very much no longer bound to their specific infrastructure, and it could be adapted quite easily so that other communities could use the system as well. There's of course, a lot of challenges around politics and potential gaming involved. So they have experience with this, and I think it's also valid as a project to start small with this, right? You could just say our contribution registry is just commit history and email address domain or something like that. And then you start small, or even like our GitHub sponsors, or I don't know, something like that, right? But it is already something that is more quantifiable, and therefore something that a public procurement officers will feel more confident to actually use, right? And not again fall back to price criteria and things like that. And then you could have other registries like assessments. So any type of assessment also lands in a registry and references that project specifically, right? And that could then also be added to the catalog. And another thing that I think could be interesting is if users of open source start publishing what they're using, maybe not the specific version, but what they're using. And NIS2, and I'm not an expert in EU policy, kind of also starts to create some kind of pressure to publish what you're using, right? And that, again, could be another signal that get added to the catalogs. And that could be very, very useful. So as with all data, the more data you have that you can correlate together, the more powerful it becomes. And so, yeah, at the end, these catalogs, they can crawl this information, put it together, maybe already do some filtering, and then procurement officers can then work with these catalogs as their sourcing tool. Yeah, let's skip this. So at the end of the day, obviously, this is all like the data in the public code YAML is owned by the project, right? So there could be outdated information, incorrect information, misrepresented information there. That's the reality. At the end of the day, it's a web of trust kind of thing where maybe a catalog trusts this project, but not that project based on their track record. Catalogs could also have sort of, I don't know, a button where people can say, I found incorrect information. So, but I think it would still be a huge asset to have it. And if projects consistently misrepresent information, then yeah, catalogs should have some way to deal with that. Something is weird. Anyway. Yes. So kind of putting it all together. So the public code YAML should supplement the existing structured information, not duplicate it. Having more data sources like usage registries, credit registries, assessment registry, things like that makes that data even more powerful. And again, I chose to extend public code YAML because I think it's a viable standard to build upon. And they already have editors for the public code YAML. They have validators, they have crawlers, and there's real world running infrastructure running these tools successfully. Now, the dialogue part that I'm hoping to have a little bit, maybe we'll see, is that, again, like, what scares you about that proposal? What worries you about that proposal in terms of effort on your end? Do you think this is, very realistic to do? What are your concerns from the perspective of the open source community? Like I said, I had probably a dozen or more talks with EU policy people, and they kind of gave their thumbs up. And most likely there's going to be an official statement from Schleswig-Holstein, maybe also from Zendes, about like they are embracing this general direction, right? But I think because the public code YAML is already established in the public sector, that's kind of the easier group to talk to. The more relevant group is the one that hasn't been using public code YAML and is being asked to adopt a public sector standard here. And so that's kind of where I hope that at the end we can have a little bit of a discussion. Yeah, this bit I already mentioned. Yeah, and I think the moment obviously is very unique. We suddenly have the EU actually thinking actively about open source, in even changing the language that they use, how they think about things, the directive that they publish, based on feedback from the open source community. And of course, a lot of that is driven by the concerns about or the need for sovereignty that has finally been identified. But yeah, I think there is an opportunity for the open source community to actually have asks and have those asks be heard, right? And so I think we should seize on that opportunity. And I think this is maybe a good example of kind of where things could go wrong, right? So the EU is starting to talk about like EU first and things like that, right? And this is of course a little bit a weird concept for open source, where, I mean, we don't hand out licenses for EU stuff, right? And it's the country of origin of a developer is usually not something that we put high emphasis on, right? And I think so I think it's very important that we engage in that dialogue and shape that dialogue so that these regulations don't come out problematic, right? So I think if we just let it flow, then yeah, it could become a problem for us. But now we can actually shape it, and we should do that. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's also, I think this entire proposal obviously has a chicken and egg situation, right? The public sector doesn't have the metadata, so they're not going to put out laws or even, recommendations to use this type of data because it doesn't exist. And conversely, the open source community say, well, if I'm the first one doing this metadata, what's it going to help me at all, right? And I'm hoping the path out of that chicken and egg situation is going to be this official blessing from Schleswig-Holstein. So again, the origin story is they came and had this ask, and I'm actually regularly in contact with somebody from the Digital Hub in Schleswig-Holstein, and who's continuously telling me, yes, we still have that need, and this what is being discussed here is going to help us in that direction. And so if they start saying we want this and going to ask the vendors, we want this, then I think this could be a start to that others will look to, right? A lot of people, other states, countries are going to Schleswig-Holstein to kind of seek how they are doing it, right? So if they go first, I think others will likely follow. And as I mentioned, I assume then they're using Open Exchange. So they will ask Open Exchange, please add this public code YAML. And step by step, I think you will have a starting point. And then as they're now expanding more and more the scope of what they're doing with open source in Schleswig-Holstein, more vendors from other open source communities will hopefully then get asked to add this type of file. And that, I think, is maybe how we kind of unblock this chicken and egg situation. I mentioned this before. Yeah, I think that's already the core of it. I actually have a ton more slides to go into details, but I think maybe we can already start with discussions. I can get the microphones, or at least one. I guess we don't really need two. And I would love to get some feedback on initial thoughts, how that relates to the open source projects. Super, danke. Yeah, and if anybody has a question they want to pose in German, I'm original German, so I can also respond. 1 second.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you for the very delightful talk. One thing that will help me a lot is to get a better understanding of successful examples of smaller companies that went on the kind of procurement to get to be a supplier for public sector. Because I know that bigger players as Red Hat, Canonical, Nextcloud, they have big teams to work the pathway for procurement. Mm-hmm. But for a smaller starting company, I absolutely no knowledge of any example that I could see the path and follow.
Well, so obviously public code YAML for the open source sector in general is not a reality. So I don't have concretely for this an example, right? But do small companies still manage to win contracts with the public sector for specific use cases, right? So that's a reality. But I think they're facing, and I think that's there I can kind of give you a concrete example. Is like they get constantly excluded essentially, right? Because the procurement team, they do an initial evaluation, and sometimes they choose the tool already, right? And so they don't even have a chance to offer because the tool is already chosen and it's not in their area of expertise, right? So again, if we have these catalogs, the procurement officers can actually find what is out there and then can choose, oh, actually the market is working really well. I don't even need to specify the exact tool. Or they maybe even pick an open source tool, I don't know, Moodle or something, right? And so suddenly they can even offer. And then rather than having to spend a lot of effort on all this evidence collection, it's already there, right? So their effort goes down. Like I was working at a web agency and it was a big debate if we want to start to offer to public tenders because the effort is so significant. It's a huge risk because it's winner takes all, right? So anything that reduces the effort that you can participate is already a win and allows you to participate. Does that address your concern? Okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I really appreciate the thought that you put into it, especially giving control to the projects, because that often when vendors get involved, we had issues where vendors just start taking over the narrative of a project, so that is very valuable. Have you thought about how projects could present the relationship to different vendors? So someone is just offering hosting, someone is also contributing back, where a project can specifically say, this and this vendor, they are officially sanctioned, and the rest is just also in the market.
Yeah, I think so obviously the credit registries has, for those that are actively contributing to the code, kind of gives them visibility. But yeah, that's a fair point. Like there are also other ways how vendors should maybe be seen. So for the OSS directory, we're now starting something that's partly to so we're now offering like a very lightweight certification that vendors can get that they have expertise in a specific project. And I could envision that this also becomes sort of more of a standard where the projects themselves do this type of thing, where they say this, and maybe it could be a way to get some money. That being said, this entire initiative on OSS directory is also being criticized, but it feels like a tax on the good ones, right? So maybe it should just be track record based rather than money based. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing where you can say, okay, we have code contributions or kind of like direct software improvement contributions, but we also have like hosting and things like that, and we kind of track that as well. Yeah, good point.
Nice proposal, if it would work, and if we had it, very good. Nice talk. 2 questions. I'm familiar with the tech world. There we have a distribution, Tech Live, which has about, say, 5,000 packages. And I believe there are vendors who use tech internally in their products. At which levels would you want to have this YAML data? At the products that some vendors ship, which has integrated tech, at the Tech Live distribution, so to speak, or also at some packages, for some packages, some of those 5,000, or maybe all. I assume that not every project has to maintain it themselves. They get it as merge requests and are then happy to have it. And when will we have this for high-level open source projects like curl or Octoprint? Because if once we have it for curl and for Octoprint, then others will see that it's useful. And
yeah, I mean, so the current process is that it's in the root of the version control system. And I think that's the right place for authority reason, again, also for ensuring that the open source community has final say. I do envision that maybe there's an interim phase where maybe the open source projects say, I don't really care yet, right? And I think that, again, it's understandable. And where maybe one vendor says, yeah, but I've did the work, here's a public code YAML, the merge request didn't get accepted, but I'll put it here, right? And maybe such an interim phase makes sense and should have also some way to kind of work. So maybe some service says, okay, here's the place where vendors can place their public code YAML files, and so we can more easily crawl that. But take it with a grain of salt because it's not blessed by the project themselves. And maybe this is also the right approach for some meta projects. Like again, OpenDesk is kind of a meta project of other projects, and maybe that is then the way that they deal with this. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Well, let's say I'm pretty sure that it should ideally be in the open source projects itself. And when it finally gets to curl, I don't know, because yeah, I mean, if that becomes a possibility, then wow, it would have been already a huge success, and we can already count the billions that we've managed to steer towards open source. And yeah, so if that ever happens, then it would be a not a miracle, but it would be a sign of gigantic success. Yeah, sure, yeah.
I have a similar, or it's the same direction of the question, because you were talking about the chicken egg problem in general, and I don't exactly see what the problem is for maintainers to just edit, because I have all the metadata already, especially I don't know, of course, if I don't have a SBOM and I have to create it first, that's a lot of effort. But just to specify where the SBOM lies and what file it is, that shouldn't be a huge deal. So where do you see, or is it really that much of an effort to add this metadata, or do I miss something there?
I don't think that the effort is gigantic, but I mean, people want to keep the root of their version control system clean, right? They don't want to put random files in there, especially standards. There are a billion, right? So this, that, right? So I think there's going to be pushback, right? And so there has to be answers. But it's also, again, I think it's fine. Like there could be value in this, even if not everybody adopts it, right? I mean, there's value in it, even if curl doesn't have that file in its repository, right? And so it's not like a binary thing at all. And maybe it's, again, like the more the vision proves itself, the more likely people will say, sure, this is a good file to add. But yeah, I think the effort shouldn't be that big. I think the data in there, once it's there, it's not going to change all that often. And if it changes, it's probably of a major milestone that the project achieves. Like they now have an SBOM, right? And then they say, yeah, I want to celebrate it. I want to show the world, right? And then I think it could be great.
You
have the mic.
Yeah. So I want to follow up, and I wonder, how do you get maintaining the data is not a problem from my point of view, but how do you get the data to the procurement officer so he can use it? Because I imagine that they not necessarily know where to find the data.
Yeah, so this is the job of the catalogs, right? So here's, for example, the one from the European Commission, right? And so they've crawled all this data, and the procurement office just says, I go to my favorite open source catalog. Maybe it's a national one, like Switzerland has one. And there's actually, it's really like officially part of the EU Commission strategy now to work with the OSPO network to establish the concept of federated open source catalogs. And so, yeah, as an open source or as a procurement officer, if I care about, maybe because I'm forced to or because I want to procure open source, I go there. And then ideally, it should be even a little bit more. There should be more classification. I can say I need a CMS again, and I can add all these filters, and I find a set of products. And it makes my life easy. I have all the evidence I need, and I can safely procure this then. So that's kind of the vision. So they're not looking at public code YAML files ever, probably, right? They're looking at the catalogs. Does that answer your question? Yes, they have to adopt it. And so there again, I have a high degree of confidence that the OSPOs and the, I've already talked to also the people maintaining the public code YAML standard themselves. So they would always have to add it to the public code YAML standard. We would have to adapt the tooling, like the crawlers and things like that. And then obviously the UI has to present it in the catalogs themselves. I'm actually not entirely sure about the code from these catalogs. I think there isn't also yet a very successful open source catalog yet, but maybe that also emerges. But yeah, this should also then become something where procurement officers will say, it would be nice to have that filter as well, and then hopefully that gets added, and maybe they do a pull request, or maybe they procure a pull request to that catalog.
I come from a procurement side, the Sovereign Tech Fund at the Sovereign Tech Agency. And one of my questions would be, what are you currently missing? Like, is funding an issue? Is adoption an issue? What's your bottleneck currently? And is there, like, are you missing money
for this idea here?
Yes.
Well, so right now it's basically me and Jörg from Digital Hub that cooked this up. Yeah. And while it's tangentially relates to my work, I'm doing this in my spare time, right? So I think what kind of holding me back a little bit is what I said earlier. Like, I have a little bit of imposter syndrome on this because I'm not an EU policy expert, right? So I read kind of what other people say about EU policy. Should also say this, I haven't mentioned it, I use LLMs to kind of digest that. And so there could be stuff that I say in the work that I've done that is wrong. So I need experts to kind of get the quality up. But at the end of the day, I think, and I laid this out, basically I need Schleswig-Holstein to commit to it and say, we mandate this. And we ask this of all the vendors. Could also be Sovereign Tech Fund, could also say we only give funding if you have the public code YAML file, I don't know. That could also be an angle. Maybe it's a little bit too forceful coercion. But yeah, or at least we pay for it. We give you an extra 5,000 if you do this. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be kind of my follow-up question. Yeah. Like, if funding or a team is missing to get this to a point that it can actually be implemented, and that there's more than just the Schleswig-Holstein angle, but there's an EU angle, there's a sovereign tech agency angle. There could be multiple paths to get this implemented rather than focusing on a singular one.
Yeah, I mean, the Sovereign Tech Fund, you of course have a bigger platform than I have. So if you say this is a great idea and you make that known, I think that would help a lot as well.
Yes, if we at some point achieve very high adoption rates and have highly populated catalogs, I see it could be the start for another metadata game where different projects try to play the system to get the most prominent way in the catalog. And this could either be by the latest entry, and this could also mean that they start spamming, adding new YAML files all the time. I think it would also be a good thing to be prepared for that, to have a strategy for that, and maybe also to have a standard within it, at least for the European catalog. And so I think for it to really scale, we also have to think about how the system could be exploited, that a lot of the time in the product can still be on building the software and instead of just playing the metadata game.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, I mean, in what I've done so far, I've kind of defined the format, and then I said, yes, catalog should use it, right? And then, but the catalog part, of course, it's a very important part. And to especially, I think, for what I mentioned with the web of trust approach, like it's their responsibility to decide what to trust, what feedback loops maybe to add to decide what no longer to trust. but I haven't worked on this, and I also don't necessarily. I have even less expertise in that. And it also is kind of like, so if it's so successful that gaming it becomes a viable business thing or strategy, that's again like that's a huge step in terms of success already, right? So but yeah, I think where the point is fair is that maybe something should have been decided early to mitigate that, right? And yeah, you don't want to change the standard all the time and start. Yeah, so I don't know if there's something that should be in the standard to kind of protect against it. Putting it into the root of the code repository, I think, is one strategy where at least malicious actors cannot put something random in that catalog, right? So I think that's one protection. But if the projects themselves start doing this, if vendors start putting fake projects everywhere, I don't know. Yeah, certainly a concern. Any other? Yeah.
Okay. I wonder how much potentially discussions or insights you have in the academic environment where the use of open source is pretty wide, and the connection between academia and public sector could be pretty close. I worked for several years in New Zealand. Perhaps that's not the best example because it's a very small country. And so decisions that are made in the public sector are, at much smaller scale. Like you can't even compare it to the EU level. But there was somewhat similar discussions on adoption of open source in the public sector. And they were very closely tangled with what the academia was doing, and they were trying to look at how the academia is doing it. It was not as formalized; it was more at the level of policies and practices. Yeah. But yeah, that could be somewhere to see how things are done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I only joined the university last year, so I'm not I don't have a track record in academia at all. The institute I work at is also in Switzerland, also not the biggest country, not even in the EU. For example, my institute again is leading on open source stuff, and I have to use Microsoft Teams and Outlook and stuff like that. And we're currently kind of pitching the university how to change that. We now successfully pitched them to fund an OSPO for the university, so I think. Obviously, university, I think, could be, if the public sector really sees it, maybe also strategy where they say, well, or let's see, I think there could be a lot of testing ground potential, right? Where I think in academia, you could try some of the things. If you're scared of doing it for your defense department, maybe you're confident enough to do it in the university context, but that also then means that you actually listen to then the findings, and maybe even you should do it as a project, maybe even co-fund it. I think the good news, I think at least for Switzerland, and maybe this is again just my institute, we've established ourselves to be kind of the place where they go and ask. So we've done study already several years ago about Microsoft Office suite replacement, and they followed up on this. So they're running a test since a couple of years now. Then the city of Zurich came to us about OpenDesk, and we did a study around this. But there's, and of course, my institute, we use Nextcloud and things like that in parallel to SharePoint. But yeah, so we do studies, but it's hard for us to actually use it. So we're trying to use now an institute, use OpenDesk, for example, ourselves. Not so trivial to convince people. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I heard that 40 to 60% of funding is public funding actually in the software market, so there's a lot of money to be made. My question is, how far did you adopt this? Is this the first time to put this out in the public, this new standard, or did you have any adoption so far?
So this is the first public talk I'm doing on this topic. But like I said, I mean, I talked to at least a dozen or more individuals, like working at SUSE, working at different entities, to kind of plant that seed. But yeah, this is the first public talk that I'm doing. It's also the reason why I chose to do it in English, so that maybe the video also helps a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds great. I'm be happy to adopt it for my project, but yeah, cannot speak for the others. But yeah, I think it's a good way to get an entry into the public funding market.
Yeah, and maybe especially because you just mentioned the figure, like 30 to 40%. But at the same time, I don't know exactly the number. The biggest criteria that is chosen by the public sector is usually price. And that's something that's also changing. The just published, what was it? I forgot the name of the thing, says exactly to push qualitative criteria more. And I think that's a huge opportunity again to get out of this process. Okay, we just buy licenses. They're cheap to buy, but you have to pay every year, right? All right. Maybe one last question. Yes?
Yes. Thanks for the presentation, firstly. Okay, I come from a very bureaucratic country, so I would like to know if the public cloud, YAML, if does it have any block or section for like bill of material and taxes and more specific things about the company that is organizing their stuff for the public sector to like be aware of these things as well?
Okay. Yeah, I think, so obviously one thing that I didn't address here, and you are making me, and this is good, is that I was talking very EU-centric here, right? And if I want the global open source community to adopt this, it should not be just EU-centric, right? And so obviously some of the information like CRA steward could be information even for countries that are not in the EU, where they say, okay, this is some person or entity to talk to. And so there are some bits in there where projects could kind of say, for example, funding related, they could say, what is our funding entities and things like that. So that type of information could land in there as well. Tax, I'm not so sure. But also maybe on bureaucratic, I don't like framing bureaucracy always in negative, right? Because I think bureaucracy has value. We just have to make sure it's the right one. All right. Thank you very much for coming.